Greetings, everyone. It's great to see you all on this beautiful day God has made. I'm the Reverend Jill Olds, the director of the Yale Youth Ministry Institute at Yale Divinity School. The YMI is very pleased to welcome all of you to today's gathering entitled Internal Welcome and External Witness, LGBTQ plus Youth Ministry with Deacon Ross Murray. This is our final gathering for this year's YMI Lunch Lab series, which is focused on a myriad of topics, things like ministry to those with disabilities, sex and tech talk with youth, a film screening of the documentary Race to be Human, where young folks discuss race, and the art of storytelling with young people. We have folks joining us from across the country and even some siblings from other regions of the world today. And whether this is your first event with us or where we are well known to you, we're delighted to have you here. Welcome. For our time today, Deacon Murray will speak to us. We'll then have a brief Q&A time at the end of his presentation. So we ask that you please remain muted throughout the session. We'll also be monitoring the chat window. So if you have a question, please do type it in there at any time. Our office has a great staff, and I just want to give a shout out to them quickly and thank them for their work. The YMI falls under the purview of the Center for Continuing Education at YDS. So Kelly Morrissey is our managing director. And today we have Megan Lukens, our communications coordinator on this webinar. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Kelly, for all that you do, and more importantly, for who you are. If you are new to us, the Yale YMI, we invite you to peruse our website when you get a chance, which is yaleyouthministryinstitute.org. We have a whole array of resources on there. We have curricula for your youth, training modules for your youth leaders. We have discussion forums, over 1,000 video clips and lectures given by the world's leading youth ministry experts. We have a lot of resources for anti-racism work, a lot of resources for youth who are working through mental health struggles. We have mission and outreach endeavors, links to other articles and materials and organizations, the works. And all of that is for free on our website. So please do check that out when you get a chance. So normally at this time, I introduce our upcoming events, and this is our final for the year. So this is a little ways away, but I do want to highlight some exciting offerings we have slated for the fall. On Wednesday, October 4th, we will host a sociologist of religion, Dr. Amy Adamczyk, for a presentation entitled Handing Down the Faith, Parents' Views of Congregations and Their Role of Their Own Experiences Growing Up and Shaping Religious Socialization. That is a title that is a mouthful, and it's going to be a very full, joyful presentation, a great offering for parents in particular, or for those of you who work with parents who might wonder how to incorporate faith lives into home life. We are also in conversation with the presenter for an in-person Saturday offering on mental health with youth for the fall. So please do keep an eye for when those registrations go live. And now it's my deep and great pleasure to introduce you all to Deacon Ross Murray. Ross is a vice president at the GLAAD Media Institute, the GLAAD Media Institute, which provides activist, spokesperson, and media engagement training and education for LGBTQ and allied community members, the media industry and advocacy organizations desiring to deepen their media impact. Deacon Murray is also a founder and director of the Naming Project, which is a faith-based camp for LGBTQ youth and their allies. He is the author of Made, Known, Loved, Developing LGBTQ Inclusive Youth Ministry, which highlights his decades of experience in the field with an eye towards LGBTQ plus inclusion and embrace. Deacon Murray is an ordained deacon in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and has a specific calling to advocate for LGBTQ plus people and to bridge the LGBTQ and faith communities. He is also a producer for the Yes Jesus podcast, a faith and sexuality affirming podcast that believes you don't have to pick between gay and God. And thanks be to God for that. Ross, welcome. We are honored to welcome you to the YMI community, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you so much, Jill. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, good evening, depending on where you are. It is Really good to be with you. We've been talking about this for months, and over this time, I'm talking about LGBTQ focused youth ministry, which has been part of my work for the last 20 years. I've been really excited to get to share this with others, and really excited to see the desire to be able to grow that in various communities. So, and I really appreciate Yale for hosting forums like this. I am going to share my screen. I have noticed I've had a little bandwidth issue. So if I am lagging, I'm sure someone will let me know, but I think when I start sharing my screen, I will turn off my camera just to try to save that bandwidth. And so let me do that. Go here, full screen, move some things around so that I can see some of you and can also see what I'm talking about. This always takes a second. And turn off my camera just because you're looking at a screen, not me now. So yes, this is internal welcome and external witness, and how we think about doing youth ministry with and for and in partnership with LGBTQ plus youth. And just to kind of get us all going here, you heard some of my bio. This is me, some of the stuff that I do. I also always like to include my contact information at the beginning. So there are always going to be follow-up questions or comments. You can see that. You heard about the book Made, Known, Loved, Developing LGBTQ Inclusive Youth Ministry, just because, I'll turn my camera back on. In a couple of weeks, I actually have a new book that's coming out that's more about advocacy for people of faith, called The Everyday Advocate, Living Out Your Calling to Social Justice. That is available through Fortress Press, starting on May 9th, but they seem to be ahead of the schedule. I just got my hard copies, so I'm like very excited about this. And you'll also kind of see when I finish this presentation, you could see me sort of lead into advocacy, which is part of my day job at GLAAD and the GLAAD Media Institute. So, and my other plug will be, part of this experience comes from my work with the Naming Project, right? And this has been a queer church camp that has been running for nearly 20 years. And if you have been to or run or worked at a church camp, you will notice this looks a lot like that. I grew up going to a church camp. I worked at one, and when we wanted to start the Naming Project and wanted to start a camp program, we said, okay, how did we do it at our particular camps? And took those elements. And then the community is the thing that has made it so queer. And so we can look at those basic elements of Bible study and worship and campfire and arts and crafts and canoeing and swimming, and find ways to make little tweaks and little twists in order to make that more inclusive. So my push is we are doing a camp this summer. It is July 23rd to 28th. It's in Bay Lake, Minnesota. You can learn more about that at the Naming Project. And that is the only gift that I share. So now you don't have to be stressed about watching those moving things like that. So just to kind of get a little bit of background about who the LGBTQ youth community is. One of the things overall in Gallup polling is that we have seen over the last 10 years a steady rise of people that will identify themselves openly as being part of the LGBTQ community, or at least something, sometimes it's been in question, not heterosexual. And you can see this kind of rise from being, under 5% in 2012 to 7.2 in 2022. Last year's at 7.1, so we're kind of holding steady right now. And you can see that market increase. But what's really interesting here is that Gen Z, this youngest generation that has been polling, I know there's Gen Alpha coming up on their heels very quickly, is nearly 20%. And that 20% actually is also held very steady for the last 2 years. So, but despite the fact that you see like, oh, it's 7% of the population, when we look at the people that are in the midst of youth ministry right now, we're looking at 1 in 5 of them to be some part of the LGBTQ community. They don't all necessarily use the same terms, and they are using more and more diverse terms to describe themselves and to talk about themselves. But they also are going to come to understand themselves to be part of that community. The other thing that we also share is that people are much more aware of LGBTQ people, have relationships with them, know them. So the number of allies is even stronger because these are their friends, right? These are their classmates. These are their family members. And so youth ministry for LGBTQ youth is not just for the LGBTQ youth, but also with the family and friends that go with them. So we're not talking about a small part of the population anymore. We are talking about a significant portion of the population. And that is already changing the makeup of who our churches are, how they relate to our church, our workforces, our schools, the way we run our society. And we're also seeing that LGBTQ youth have come with particular needs. This has always been true for a long time, right? LGBTQ youth can face bullying, can face harassment, can face erasure, can face opposition, some of that coming from churches, and that has a very personal impact on them, right? We are talking about a part of their identity. We're talking about a part of what makes them who they are. Their sexual orientation, their gender identity is not their entire identity, but they are words that they would use to describe themselves. So, I always like to say when we talk about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, any of these terms, they are adjectives that describe people. And yet, we also can see this hang up happening for a while too. The Trevor Project is a really good resource that I hope you are familiar with. If not, you should look them up. One, they provide mental health. They provide, their main project is suicide prevention. They have a hotline or a text line that youth that are really feeling alienated or in trouble can call or text and talk to someone who talk them down, help them to find resources, help them feel better about themselves. But Trevor also now publishes research as well. And I think it's helpful to sort of know how LGBTQ youth are feeling, both in society and in the church. Nearly half of them, 45%, have seriously considered attempting suicide in the last year. And that number is much higher if you kind of break this apart. Transgender youth, and we'll talk about why that is in a few slides here, are facing much higher suicidal ideation, where nearly 1 in 5 have attempted suicide, and LGBTQ youth of color have higher rates than their white peers. So this is not evenly distributed among the LGBTQ community. There's disproportionate impacts that fall on transgender youth and youth of color, right? But if they feel support from their family, it cuts the suicide ideation and the suicide attempts by nearly half, right? And so you can see that having supportive adults in their lives can be particularly helpful. And then you see that fewer than 1 in 5 of transgender or non-binary youth find their home to be gender affirming. Right? So having those supportive adults makes a huge difference. It is best if it's your family, if those closest relationships that you have, but even having other supportive adults in your life can also make a huge, huge difference. And so you see here, LGBTQ youth who found their school to be affirming will lower the rates of attempting suicide. And youth want mental health and mental support. And a lot of them are having difficulty accessing that, perhaps because of their local community. It's a resource that's not available. Perhaps they don't feel like they can be out enough to get those kind of supports. And this, kind of reiterating here more and more, we need supportive adults just in order to lower rates of self-harm, of suicide. And that's coming from Trevor. You can kind of see how that has ebbed and flowed over the years. And as youth ministry practitioners, I want us to be those people that can help to reduce the rates of self-harm, of suicide ideation. The nice thing, the great thing that for me is that Trevor also put out a report just at the end of last year that talked about religion and spirituality among LGBTQ youth. And so we can see that 1 in 5 LGBTQ youth report that their religion or their spirituality is important or very important to them. That's the big headline that sort of got taken away from this report. And I want to make a note about that. When we started the naming project, one of the things that often shows up is this narrative that to be part of the LGBTQ community means inherent conflict with your religion or inherent conflict with your spirituality. And that doesn't have to be true, right? There are people who find supportive church homes, worshiping community homes, supportive communities, and get to live out their call. I get to be one of them, right? I'm a deacon, and I'm openly gay, and I do this particular work. And so we don't have to have this conflict. And we see that there's still pretty high levels of spirituality among LGBTQ youth. you can see here sort of the breakdown in terms of religion, spirituality for LGBTQ youth by race, and seeing indigenous spirituality is incredibly important and also tied in with identity. Middle Eastern, North African, very high levels of religiosity or spirituality among youth. And these various levels, right, that you kind of see as a breakdown for race, which I think is also particularly important, because sometimes people also will pull in this false notion of a conflict between someone's race and they're being part of the LGBTQ community. And LGBTQ people are part of every walk of life, urban, rural, every race, every gender, every ability, every class, right? And so we don't just say that doesn't exist within this community. It is part of every single community. You can see, like, for spiritual practices, things like prayer or meditation, how often someone does it, right? What kind of spiritual practices they do. And I find this sort of interesting. You know, if we're seeing ourselves as youth ministry practitioners, we can also help young people to develop those spiritual practices that are going to give them a sense of purpose, a sense of community, a sense of connection and being with God, with a higher power, with how they can feel themselves connected to the rest of the world. You know, very few are doing it on a daily basis. I think this is a growth area that we could help to build and develop, and that we can do some of that teaching and training and guiding with which to do that. And then, of course, because it's Trevor, what are those mental health what are the mental health outcomes for this as well, right? And if spirituality is important to them, then how high are their levels of anxiety and depression, or suicide ideation or attempts, right? And you can see that spirituality can make a difference. It's not a gigantic difference, but one I think that we can also, by making affirming churches, by making affirming places of worship and communities, we can help to lower those as well. And it doesn't just do it for the youth that are in our congregations or in our, you know, direct care. Also, how we communicate that out to the wider world is going to have those outcomes for people, even if they don't necessarily come into our church. And that is one thing I'm going to talk about a little bit later, about how we can look at this. But I think this always helps kind of ground of, like, how many LGBTQ youth are there? How often how much are they in our churches? What is their beliefs and spiritual practices? And seeing that this can be an area where we can both help to develop and change and grow, and meet the needs of people that are in our communities, even if they're not necessarily in our, you know, worshiping communities. All right, so then how do you do it? One of the reasons why I wrote Made Known Loved is I got so many emails asking how to do something, right? How should we do? The most common question, I laugh about this, most common question, and some of you might be putting this in the chat right now, I want to know about sleeping arrangements and housing at your camp. How did you do that? How do you group kids together? Who do you keep apart? Who do you group together? Stuff like that. And there's always a big, like, it depends. One of the big it depends is, what are your values, right? What is most important to you? The logistics about how we're going to group people, what sleeping arrangements are, what kind of programming we're going to do, what we're going to talk about, really should be determined by what is the most important for you as a community, right? So another way to ask that is, why are we doing it this way? You probably already have a standard practice, things that you are doing or leading. And just to put an examination on that, it's like, what's the purpose of this? What are we trying to accomplish? What assumptions exist within the way that we run this? Sometimes we look at it and realize our assumptions are that we don't have LGBTQ youth. Maybe our assumptions are that all the boys are going to be attracted to all the girls. I don't know. How many of you, I should open the chat here for this question, put a note in the chat if you have ever said the phrase, or maybe heard the phrase, boys are blue, girls are pink, don't make purple. That has been a cutesy shorthand youth ministry phrase that I have heard in time. There's a lot of assumptions behind that, right? And some of those assumptions are incorrect, and we can examine and talk about that. And then to say, oh, if what we're really trying to say is, you know, please don't have sex at church camp, maybe a better rule is, don't have sex at church camp, which is a rule that can apply for everyone, not just something that makes some of these particular assumptions. And then also, of course, what do we value, right? What do we want to do? For us, that might be sharing the gospel. For some of us, that might be seeing youth as a mission field, helping youth to grow into spiritual adults, right, that are strong. So our assumptions can a little bit be based on that. So potential values it could have, right? Faithfulness. We are trying to build faith. We want people that are faithful. Maybe a value is privacy, right? We want people to feel safe and secure in community, and maybe beyond privacy, I should say safety. It's probably a better word too. Privacy is a part of safety. And when your privacy is violated, you don't feel safe. So I should level that up a little bit. Authenticity. Are you being the person that God made you to be? Self-identity. Do you get to tell us who you are, or am I telling you who you are? And even transparency, right? These logistical questions that we get, there are reasons why we do it. And sometimes if we just say, here's the reason why we did what we did, can also explain, here's the process, even if it's not the most ideal solution, right? And so we can talk about, transparency as here's why we did what we did. And then if it needs to be tweaked and changed, we can do it. But people at least can be partners with us on how we build that so we can accomplish those same values. So some that we have for ourselves at the Naming Project, right? All campers should feel safe at our camp and in our programs. Everyone should have a reasonable expectation of privacy, even while we know that we are living and functioning in community together. We don't give people absolute privacy. That's kind of isolation. People do interact, people do share sleeping spaces, right? And then the other guideline that we have for ourselves, which is adults, when campers, or frankly, anyone is talking about themselves and telling us who they are, we are going to listen to them. And we are going to believe that what they tell us is true, and we are going to treat them accordingly. That seems really simple, but I will say it can be really tricky sometimes to do. Because often as adults, we feel like we know better who they are than the youth themselves. We know what their future's like. Even me, as a gay adult, I see a young person, I'm like, oh my goodness, you're just like me. You're going to grow up to be. The reality is they're not just like me, right? They are growing up in a different time, in a different generation, in a different geography, with different spaces. And maybe I can see some parts of myself in them, but also, they are independent people that are going to have to tell me who they are and maybe sometimes break those expectations that I have for who they are. And then if they tell us something, and sometimes for young people, this happens at our camp, they'll say, this is who I am. We'll say, okay. And they'll come back next year and say, you know what? I've lived a little bit of life. I've realized this, and actually this is more accurate to who I am. Then we say, okay, we're going to adjust to this new thing about you told us, because you are learning who you are in that process, which is what adolescence really is. All right, so these values determine logistics, right? We want to build these policies and procedures so that they will minister to people. We don't just try to fit people into our policies and procedures. We may not have built our programs, our rules, our ways of operating with LGBTQ youth in mind. We may not have realized that transgender people were a part of our community, or gay or lesbian or bisexual or non-binary or anyone else. And so we say, if this guideline doesn't serve our purposes, then we have to find a different way in which to operate. So I'm going to go through these are some of the logistics, right? Questions to ask yourself, forms, registration forms, right? What information do you really, really need? We don't ask campers what their sexual orientation is. That really isn't necessary for me to figure out groupings or sleeping arrangements or anything else. Maybe they will tell us that, but if they don't, I don't have to pry and ask that, right? We do ask for gender. But what we do is what you see here on the slide is that we make it a blank. Instead of a checkbox, do you fit into one of these boxes? I give a blank and I will say, tell me what your gender is. And then when I get the registration forms, I can look at that, and that is how I can do groupings. We still group our campers based on roughly on gender, but I have to know how many youth I have, particular gender, to figure out what the best grouping is going to be. How many blanks for parents? This is not just an LGBTQ thing, but parents that are divorced and remarried might mean that there are multiple adults. And I'll be honest, for safety purposes, we have 3 blanks for parents, parent 1, parent 2, parent 3, and then I have 2 more blanks for non-parent emergency contacts. And my reasoning for that is, if God forbid, something terrible happens and I have to rush a kid to the hospital, I am calling everyone I can until I can reach an adult that is connected to this child, right? I want the parents involved. And if I can't get the parents right away, I want who the next point of contact is. I want that information. How are parents identified? I mentioned this here. We do parent one, parent two. And like I said, it's kind of the order I'm going to go down. Who should I be calling first? Who should I be calling second? Mother and father, obviously, is an assumption the child has, both a mother and a father, as opposed to two mothers or non-binary parents, right? This lets them talk about what their relationship is, again, without having to fit the parents into a mold that I already have. Bathrooms. This is another very much it depends, right? We're beholden to architecture. If we all had millions of dollars, we could raise our buildings to the ground and we rebuild them. And I could give you suggestions on ways to do restrooms and bathrooms and showering facilities that are safe and way more inclusive, but we really don't have that, right? So what are the modifications that we can make based on what we have? Is every place accessible? Do you everywhere have menstrual products available? And it's not just in one particular room where someone might not be able to get access to them. If you don't have, gender inclusive restrooms, what does your signage look like? We sometimes if there is a men's room and a women's room, because that's just how things are built. We've put a sign up like this that says like, this is a single stall restroom, which means it doesn't have to be gendered, right? So we made that sign that's there at the top that says roses are red, violets are blue, gender's not binary, this bathroom's for you, right? That was our way of saying it's not the women's room, this is a single stall restroom, it can be for anyone. Or use the restroom that best aligns with your gender. And then it means we're not going to stigmatize or police who uses what restrooms. We're not going to monitor that. We're going to trust that people are using the best restroom for themselves. If you can change the signage, my other recommendation, this actually comes from my office at GLAD, is instead of telling people who the bathroom is for, tell them what's in the restroom and then make the assumption that people are using the restroom that is the best fit for them. As someone that will use a urinal and likes it, it's sometimes quicker and easier, I would like to know where that is. And I will also make those assumptions, right? And like it when the urinal has some privacy around it too. But where's the urinal? Where is a toilet? Where is a baby changing station? Which room is accessible, right? Stuff like that is important. And then building privacy into that. Sometimes you have control over this, sometimes you don't, but there are things you can do. And I can, in the Q&A, if you want to talk about this, I can kind of go through like my progression of like, here's what the ideal would be, and also here's what else we can do. All right, here's the sleeping arrangements. Again, we're still a little bit beholden to architecture, but we're also beholden to the makeup of campers, right? So at the naming project, the very first year when everyone asked us how we were going to do sleeping arrangements, we decided in that first year that we went into the cabins, we took the mattresses off the bed and we all brought them into the chapel, and everybody slept together on the floor of the chapel on mattresses, like you would with a lock-in in your church, right? Everybody had privacy because nobody had privacy, right? If you wanted to go change, use the restroom, the bathrooms were there for that level of privacy. But in terms of us sleeping, we were all sleeping together. And that holds a different level of accountability. Everyone's in the room, which means everyone is hearing and seeing each other and keeps that accountability up. Makeup of campers is also the other piece, right? Some camps will create what gets called like a gender neutral cabin or a gender queer cabin. That works unless you have only one transgender or non-binary camper. You don't want to put one kid out in a cabin by themselves. That's isolating, right? And kind of harmful. And so think about doing the arrangements, again, based on who you have. This means that the naming project, I don't do housing arrangements really until the last minute, until I have all the registrations in. And then I look at what everyone has said, and then I figure out the grouping, and then I put them together. And sometimes, because parents sometimes fill out the forms and they don't always know everything about their kids. Sometimes when I meet the child, I'm like, oh, I need to make a switch. And I will do that quickly and easily and discreetly as much as possible, right? I will say this too. So that's what we now have now at our camp, we have a lodge. And we put about 4 kids in a room. Every room has its own bathroom, has a locking door, with a shower and a toilet behind it. And the two sinks are kind of out, which means people's privacy is there behind that locked door. People can brush their teeth and whatever at the sinks. 4 people are sharing a room together, and we still have people keep the doors to their rooms open, which means our space is also still semi-public, semi-private. And that keeps that group accountability together. That works for us. If you're on a trip, and you're staying in hotel rooms, the best thing for privacy is everyone having a hotel room by themselves, but that is also cost prohibitive. Youth ministry people love to cram as many youth into one room as possible. And so you got to also think about, what's the way to do this? And I will say this too, if you've got maybe a transgender camper, just shoving them in with kids that are the same sex assigned at birth as them, can be awkward and uncomfortable, right? For the trans kid as well. Just putting them with people they don't know, maybe even with the gender that they're telling you who they are, also can be awkward and uncomfortable. Maybe the best thing for safety, for decreasing harassment or bullying or making people feel uncomfortable is putting that camper with other friends with which they have pre-existing relationships. There is trust that's there. That means it's a consideration that's made other than gender, but actually puts safety at the forefront, both for let's say the transgender youth and the other youth as well. And so think about something like that. That can be the way to do it because it actually keeps people safer. And there's an expectation, and you can talk to them and say, I'm putting you all together because you have a pre-existing relationship. This is where and how I expect you're going to behave, right? That's a communication that you can do with the youth, and if you can, with their families as well. Sorry, my throat's getting dry, so. Dividing up youth into teams and small groups. Group by characteristics other than gender. Find some ways that you can also do creative ways of grouping young people. When we do small groups for the naming project, usually on the first day, I make sure I divide up my returning campers and I make sure I divide up my new campers. I don't want the returning campers to all make a clique by themselves, and I want the new campers to be spread out and feel like they can hear from people that have been here before, right? That's a grouping that's done differently. On my second day, quite honestly, I will group campers based on, I will put all the strong personalities in one group. I will put all the quiet kids in one group, and I usually have a third group that's kind of the in between. And that just means, like, for all the dominant talkers, they get to sort of like work out their pecking order. It also lets the kids who don't get to talk get a chance to talk because they're not being dominated, right? That's a different type of grouping. And we do sometimes do gender specific gatherings, right? When we want to talk about what it means to be a boy, what it means to be a girl, what it means to be non-binary or trans or something in between, we sometimes will offer 3 groups. This is the time at our camp that it's the only time we let the youth choose their own groups. And again, it is, what do you need in this moment? If you are a boy, then go meet in this room over here. If you are a girl, meet in this room over here. If you think you don't fit into either one of those two, if you're something in between or other, or just figuring out, we're going to have a group that's also that can meet here. It is possible that youth really could fit in more than one room, but you can't physically be in one room at the same time. So which room is going to be the most helpful for you in this moment? And we promise there will be more conversations about this as the week goes on. And that's part of how we do some of these like small groups. One of the other big things that often shows up that's helpful to review is our songs and our liturgy. Take a look at the repertoire. What are the songs that we sing? Churchy songs, Christian songs especially, have a history of not being very inclusive. We have very specific language, gendered language for God. We have gendered language for people a lot. And I don't just want to throw out songs, but we can find ways to maybe tweak them. I have changed the pronouns that get used for God oftentimes in songs, sometimes willy-nilly. I will tell campers that I do that. So they can sometimes hear he, they can hear she, they can hear they. You can find ways in which you can do that. There are new songs that are inclusive, that use images for God and for people. And part of teaching that just helps to expand our repertoire, right? And then, of course, there's always the ability to write your own song. When I was a camp counselor back in college, I wrote a church song on a dare from a friend. It's a stupid song. It is called Frip Frop. If you wrote down my email address, you'll notice my email is also Frip Frop. And And that song has lasted. They still sing it at that camp. It's repetitive, it's simple. Again, it's a dumb song, but it has that lasting power to say we can write something, right? And we've got musically gifted people. Sometimes I encourage my campers to write their own songs because I want to be showcasing the music that they're making. And if we communicate this to them up front, they can also help to contribute to that, right? They know the decision-making process that we're doing. They know where these songs come from, how we might be changing them. And they can also be a part of that process with us. So I kind of mentioned that like going through these things sort of like an audit, right? Like your songs and your liturgy, the way you do things, your rules, your policies, your forms. And I gave you some like values lenses, other lenses that you can use to consider as you look through how you do what you do, right? Lenses for God and people. Bodies. How do we talk about bodies? How do we treat bodies? What are our rules about what parts of the bodies need to be covered and which ones are okay to be exposed, especially thinking of camps that have swimming or trips that have swimming, stuff like that. And then how do we accommodate to talk about bodies and sometimes bodies that don't fit the expectations that we have? How do we think and talk about gender? Do we think about it in terms of, God made them male and female? Do we also realize that, God made male and female, God made night and day, but God also made noon and twilight and dusk and Vespers hour, and God made land and sea, but God also made beaches and marshes and estuaries and floodplains. And thinking that expansive way in gender and how that reflects itself in our practices, policies, procedures, right? How do we talk about families, both the immediate family that we have, the parents and the siblings? How do we talk about the family of God? How do we talk about chosen family that's gathered around us? How do we talk about and consider sexuality and who people are, knowing that that's a part of what we do, which is separate from sex itself, right? Sexuality is kind of part of that innate internal, who we are, who we're attracted to, who we want to be in relationship with. Sex is one, there's the biological sex, right? That we can talk about anatomy and hormones and chromosomes. Sex also is young people should also be taught values in how to be able to make decisions about sex and what kind of relationships they want to form, how to make smart choices about what they want to do and what they don't want to do, or when it's the appropriate time to do or not do something. And having really good, honest conversation that is faithful. That's not just good for LGBTQ youth, that's good for all youth. And I would argue that's one of the big things that I think that sometimes has been missing as we do that boys are blue, girls are pink, don't make purple kind of things. What if we talk about how do we form relationships that don't have to be based on sex? And when someone does decide that they are going to be sexually active, how do we make sure that they can be as safe and protected and values driven, and what conditions should be met, and how they honor themselves as a created and beloved child of God as they go into these relationships with other people? Okay, I've got a little pivot here before I let you go. Let's assume that you have gone through all of this and you've made your church and your ministry all this safe and affirming place for LGBTQ youth. They feel welcomed, they can be in your space. That is great. Here's your congratulations graphic, right? And it's also possible that your congregation, your ministry might be an oasis in what might be an otherwise hostile world for LGBTQ youth. And I can't overstate how important it is to have that oasis, have those supportive adults, right, in young people's lives, and knowing that a church can be. But the reality is that there is a lot more to do. And we got to start thinking more about what LGBTQ youth ministry looks like when those youth are not necessarily part of our church. There's a couple ways I want to think about this. One, the partners that we do ministry with. Sometimes we, work with those, go to those youth gatherings that are organized by groups, or we go on service trips that are being organized and run by other organizations. You want to make sure that these partners that you work with, that your young people are also partnering with, are also affirming in the same way that you are. And you can do that by asking some questions. And you want to do this because, quite frankly, a lot of, I'm calling them parachurch organizations come from non-affirming denominations. A lot of their business comes from evangelical churches, a lot of places that have an anti-LGBTQ culture or policy or theology. And it's important to know that. And I'm not saying not work with them, but I will say you do want to ask questions, because whatever thing you do with the gathering that's organized by someone else or the service project or whatever is an extension of the ministry that you're doing. And you want to make sure that the places you're working with also match with your values. And so you've got to ask these very detailed questions. Some of these questions can include things like, what is your sleeping arrangements like? How would you end up treating someone who tells you that they're gay or that they're transgender or that they're bisexual? What kind of work roles do you give people? Are they divided up kind of by gender, where boys are doing construction projects and girls are reading to toddlers? How do you do forms that recognize and talk about the parents? What kind of teaching or theology infuses things like debriefs or Bible studies or devotions or worship? Who are the speakers that you have speaking at your gathering? And all these questions really like ladder up to, will LGBTQ youth feel safe and be safe participating in your program, right? What's their experience going to be like? And are they going to end up not feeling safe in this community? You might get a non-specific response like a "we welcome everybody." That's why those detailed questions are incredibly important, because you want to know what the actual experience is going to be. Welcome often means you can sign up, right? Welcome often means you can donate money. But what is that experience going to be like? And is that going to be safe enough? And then you have to ask some deeper questions. What is the grounding theology that underscores the work that you do? Do any portion of your fees go to programs or campaigns that are working to diminish legal protections for LGBTQ people? Has your organization supported anti-LGBTQ legislation in Congress, state legislatures in other country? Any of your organization's leaders or staff or board been associated with high anti-LGBTQ organizations? And then on the flip side, do you have LGBTQ staff? Right? Do you have anyone who's working with you? These things are also helpful. And the underlying question of that is, if I am part of this ministry, am I supporting, with my LGBTQ youth, am I supporting the harm of LGBTQ people through my participation, right? Am I hurting the youth that I am trying to reach and that I'm trying to minister to? These are not easy questions to ask. And I really just want to recognize and acknowledge that that can be a little bit challenging. But it's necessary for the youth that are in your program, and probably for other youth that are participating that maybe no one did ask those questions on behalf of them too. Youth, if they feel connected with a community, they want to be a part of it. And when they hit those barriers to welcome, that can actually be incredibly detrimental for their faith, for their identity, and realizing that they don't have that level of support. The last thing I want to talk about before we just have conversation is what I'm calling public witness outside the congregation, right? This is the idea that not all young people are going to be a part of our community, is going to be part of our churches. They may never walk in the door of our building. And I think youth ministry is just as important for youth that aren't in our congregations. And I want to push us to think about youth ministry. It's where this book about advocacy sort of comes in here, about how we do this. This is just the reality in which we live today. This is a website that I track that's been run by someone who's teaching at Harvard. And I have to update this graphic every day. I think it actually is out of date even by now. We are at nearly 500 anti-LGBTQ bills that are in state legislatures that were introduced this year so far. This number changes constantly. The vast majority target LGBTQ youth. The vast majority target transgender youth. And you can see that some of them fail, most of them do not get enacted, but they do, but enough of them do to be able to cause harm. You can see a breakdown, kind of a rough breakdown of the nature of these bills. Medical care for transgender youth, states that are introducing bans on and making it a felony for a doctor to provide medical care for a transgender youth. In some cases, punishing parents for supporting their youth with proper medical care. And I want to say this too, all of the major medical and psychological associations say that transition-related care, gender-affirming care is life-saving and essential. And so these bills and these laws actually go against what has been considered the best standard practice. The other big one has been sports bans, keeping young people from participating in athletics. And, you know, I always think athletics is one of those things that people participate in so they can become better people. Excuse me. Becoming well-rounded, being with their peers, building skills, building out their resume for when they want to apply for college, and cutting that off from them, cuts them off from their peers and their friends, the way that gender-affirming care can cut them off from doctors and parents. A lot of ones related to schools, right? Like don't say gay bills you might have heard of from Florida last year, or forced outing of students to their parents. Drag bans, transgender bathroom bans, other ones you can kind of see get introduced here too. This is every year. Last year, we were at over 350 bills. The year before, we were at over 250 bills. This has been increasing every single year. And this is the message that LGBTQ young people are hearing on a constant basis, whether they're living in a state that's introduced more than 50 of them, like Texas, or whether they're in a state that hasn't introduced any of them yet, or that these bills may not actually pass because of whatever the makeup of the legislature is. This is important for us as churches. It's important for us as youth ministry people to be paying attention to and putting our voices in the mix, because the assumption right now is that religious voices, Christian voices, are behind bills like this. And there's not been very loud or vocal opposition from a faithful perspective to bills like this. So how do we do that, right? We don't have to do this alone. I'm throwing up a list of resources. And I also want to say that way that we speak out, I should go back to this just to talk about how we can kind of, what can we do about it? A lot of these are, what I'm talking about here are state legislatures. Your faithful presence as a youth ministry person, as a representative, showing up at school board meetings, at city council meetings, in your local community, being vocal about the welcome that your church has, and that bills like this harm youth, maybe violate your religious values, or would force you to violate your religious values, is ways that you can show up. You can also go to your state legislature, but also local makes a lot of sense. Local can be really helpful and supportive. Writing op-eds, being vocal, being visible. You can preach about it and teach about it in your congregation, but please, please, please do it also wider in your community, because you are the ones that have influence in your community. And now, the resources, right? You do not have to do this alone. You've heard that I'm part of GLAD. You see the GLAD media reference guide. That's good for language and terminology. I did not do like an LGBTQ 101 language and terminology. I want to get into the heart of it. But if you've got questions about what does this mean, or I've heard this term, that's great for looking stuff up. The naming project, I hope you will see as a resource for yourself. Affirming Youth Ministries, statewide LGBTQ organizations. I put Outfront Minnesota here. I'm from Minnesota, so I have a bias toward them. But every state has an LGBTQ organization like that, and they care about young people, and they may also have a faith program. Affirming Youth Ministries and Beloved Arise are other youth faith, queer youth of faith programs. And then I put up some books here too, and I was going to hold them up here too, but Made Known Loved is my book. Everyday Advocate is my book. Transforming is really good for understanding the lives of transgender Christians. Queerfully and Wonderfully Made is a great book that's sort of written like a field guide for LGBTQ Christian teens, helping to answer some of those questions. Each chapter is about 2 pages long and centered around a question about, like, what about a non-affirming family? How should I express myself? When do I come out? Stuff like that. And Welcoming Affirming is a really companion piece that goes with it for the adults that work with youth. The Yes Jesus podcast I put on here. That is not very youth focused. That is very adulty. We make a lot of adult humor, but we also look at and talk about scripture. We talk about stories. It's a comedy podcast, so it is very irreverent, and we make a lot of jokes. But we really look at some of those stories where LGBTQ youth might see themselves reflected and identified. And the more I read the Bible the more I see stories of LGBTQ people showing up, those themes that we can relate to. I don't think any of the people in the Bible would ever have called themselves gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender. Those are new words that we use today. It's not going to be there. But I also know Esther had to deal with this, with coming out, and what the impact of coming out was going to be for her and herself. I know that Joseph wore that Technicolor dream coat that we made a musical out of, that may have been a really gender non-conforming princess dress. And if you think of the reaction to the older brothers, maybe it wasn't jealousy, maybe it was shame that this little kid showed up wearing a really loud, flashy, big dress, and bringing shame on the family. Maybe Jesus talking to his disciples about, what do they say about me? What are they saying about me, about who I am? And then asking his closest friends, what do you say about me? What's our relationship going to be like? That makes a huge difference, right? We can do all sorts of these stories. I'm happy to talk about those scripture stories. I would say one more, Psalm 139, right? I am fearfully and wonderfully made. That is an affirmation that young people can hear. And then along the bottom, I'm just going to say some like film and television. Mama Bears is a great documentary about moms, mostly evangelical moms, that have come to love and support and become fierce advocates for their children. Disclosure is a great documentary that helps you to understand the history of media representation of transgender people in film and television, and how that has shaped what we think about transgender people. Definitely worthwhile 90 minutes of your time. Changing the Game on Hulu focuses on youth athletes, transgender youth athletes, and why they love their sport, how they fell in love with it, and also the barriers that they exist just by trying to participate. And then a fictional thing, Pose, something that can also show what a chosen family looks like and how people provide that level of love and support and care for each other at a time in our history when that love and support and care really wasn't there. And again, I want to make sure you've got my contact information. There's my email. That's me on social media in lay terms. You've got my website. Very happy to answer more questions after this presentation is over. But I also know that we built in some time for ourselves to ask questions here. So now that I'm done with my presentation, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to turn my camera back on. I'm going to let you see. I'm going to actually look at the chat to see what you've been saying while I was here. And then Jill, if you have any starters that you want to get started with, I'm happy to chat there.
Yeah. Ross, thank you so much. That was a deep dive into just a treasure trove of material. So thank you very much for that. Yeah, a couple of quick questions. The one I saw in the chat primarily, a few folks are wondering about the source for the 450 plus bills that were introduced. You mentioned something about Harvard, and folks couldn't catch quite where that was from. So do you have a location for that?
Actually, I'm going to give you a different one that's a little easier to track. The hard part with this has always been what they're actually counting gets really tricky, but the Equality Federation does a pretty good job of breaking things down state by state. And I am going to, while we're talking, I'm just going to pull up the tab on state legislation, and I will also drop it in the chat because this is one of the other really good places that you can see what pro and anti-LGBTQ bills are being introduced. So it's going in right now.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Folks, let us know if you have additional follow-up questions for that, and feel free to throw anything into the chat at this point. It's free form, but I'll start out with a few that I have just to get us going. Sure. So I was struck with some of the Trevor Project's findings, and I was looking at something actually that you had shared with me in advance that I don't think you shared here, or at least not in depth. But you talk about the prevalence of depression, anxiety, et cetera, from the Trevor Project's findings, and specifically when looking at religiosity of youth. Can you share a little bit about what that looked like? Because I found that very intriguing and could kind of cut a few different ways. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, and part of what we've sort of seen has been this sometimes that data gets really tricky to share because people jump into the why behind it, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm one of the prevalent things that has often shown up when people view being part of the LGBTQ community as a deficit, as a mental disorder, as a sickness, things like this. And you're like, well, of course these things happen because this is a disorder, right? That has to get fixed. What I think we don't actually think and talk about that has happened so much in our churches as we try to like push people into these policies or these procedures, or try to advocate for this worldview, is that we make life really difficult for people. And our churches can be part of that problem, and historically have been a part of that problem. And so we, it also means if I am, this is part of those bills, if I am cutting you off from supportive doctors, if I am punishing your parents for supporting you, if I'm not letting your teachers say or do something, if I'm not letting you participate in activities with your friend, and you feel this sense of isolation, yes, you're going to feel depression, anxiety, all things that go with that too. It's not because they're LGBTQ, it's because they are having to navigate barrier after barrier after barrier after barrier. And I've been in some of my advocacy training stuff, I've been with groups, they talk about minority stress and about resiliency. And resiliency is a good thing, and we can celebrate it, but we could also do things where people didn't have to be resilient, and they could put their time and energy and attention into something else that also is probably a stress on their life too, and not say, I don't want to have to fight at school, I don't want to fight at churches constantly. And I think part of mental health, you see how that supportive adult helps so much with reducing suicidality. Let's put more of those types of adults in people's lives and let them be supportive, safe guides that can also help young people see and learn and know who they are, so they can actually feel more stable about themselves and move out and be a stronger supportive person in the world.
That's really salient. That makes a lot of sense. And, I think for those of us who come from faith communities, that it can be such a good potential hub of support and care in that way. And we have a question in the chat sort of that's tangentially related to that. Susan is wondering, do you have a reference guide for Bible stories that would lead to insightful discussions about LGBTQ?
Okay, this is gonna be the next book that I want to write, because and I already said, yes, Jesus is very adulty. So my big disclaimer is don't say that's part of youth ministry, because you want to listen to it first. We care a lot about LGBT youth, but also as we do a lot of adulty kind of content in it. But the best places that I've done Bible studies have actually been through those. And so if you look through those episodes, I'm a producer. I rarely appear on air, but often write their scripts, partly because the very first time I worked with them, the hosts said, we want to talk about David and Jonathan, right? Like the couple that often people are like, oh, they had a relationship. What's going on here? And so my first task is, well, I'm going to go dig through 1st and 2nd Samuel. And of course, these are 2 books of the Bible. And it's pretty epic. I was like, we're going to skip through a lot of wars and a lot of other stuff just to be like, what are the times that David and Jonathan interact with each other? And you put that together and you go, oh my goodness, there was a relationship there. The first time that Jonathan again, I don't want to spoiler alert it, but first time Jonathan laid eyes on David, which was after Goliath's death, Jonathan stripped in front of him and then pledged his fidelity to him in the moment, right? This is beyond West Side Story, love at first sight kind of moment. This is and they kiss, they cry. Jonathan's a double agent. Jonathan tries to stand up to his dad. His dad actually calls him, honestly, good translation would be a son of a bitch. And we're reading this, and Daniel and Azariah, who come from a pretty fundamentalist tradition, say no one's ever talked about this story in this way. And again, we can't call them bisexual. We can't call them a couple. The world was very different then. But those show up. And so then it was well, let's go dig through and find what these other ones are. And so I'm going to rattle a bunch off super quick right now. I know I did before. And then go find those episodes. I will say, here's my other disclaimer. Because it's Yes, Jesus, we call them baked Bible stories, and the 2 hosts get high on weed and then tell these Bible stories to each other. I'm not high when I write the script, but also this has been one of their things. So if you are not a drug person, I'm sorry about that, but that's part of it. You can always see the logo says baked Bible story. You can see a little thing with that. Dave and Jonathan, Ruth and Naomi is an example of 2 women pledging their fidelity to one another. It's not a sexual relationship, it's not a romantic relationship, but it also is a we are stronger together than we ever would be separately. There is Jesus and the beloved disciple, who we don't know who the beloved disciple is. Maybe it was Mary Magdalene, maybe it was John, maybe it was somebody else, but there is some like reclining and laying together, and I can be close enough to you to ask the hard questions of like, who is it that could betray you? I mentioned Esther and coming out. I mentioned Joseph of Genesis, and that the thing that we translate as coat so often in English, realizing that, and I didn't study Hebrew enough, Ketenet Pasim is worn by Joseph, and then is worn by King David's daughter, with the explanation of that is what daughters of the king wore. So princess dress might be a good translation. I just, even more recently, since we just went through Holy Week and Easter too, Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, and just thinking of a comparison between that and the modern debate around pride parades and who should show up, and do we want that corporate involvement and people waving their rainbow flags the way that people were waving and laying down palm branches on the street, and then when things get difficult, everyone abandons and pretend. There's a big debate right now, right? Like, well, are you going to show up at Pride after you didn't help us during this really hard legislative session? Like, imagine Jesus doing that in reverse. You all showed up when I rode the donkey into town, but now that I'm on trial, now that I'm being executed, where are all the people that were like singing Hosanna? That sort of parallel shows up. Philip in the Ethiopian eunuch, and the conversation about having an outsider, and even the role of eunuchs in society. Eunuchs are different than transgender people. And yet there is this thing people might come to understand about, like, who is someone? How does changing someone's body make them fit into society or make them not fit into society? All these things are relatable, and you can kind of just go through it. And it's not calling these people LGBTQ, right? Like, that's a very modern phrase that doesn't work for that time.
Right.
But it means I see myself in those stories. It means that my trans friends have said they've seen themselves in those stories. And it means that young people that are looking for examples of, like, is anyone else there ever thought or feel the same way that I do? Telling the biblical characters have thought and felt the same way that they have as well. I'll say one more, like Jonah, as a catty gay man, Jonah's a very petty prophet. And if you read that from this, like, I don't want to help them get better, and you know what, I want to just sit here and watch their destruction, and then God doing this like petty thing back to Jonah too, of like, well, let's grow a little tree and make you feel, oh, I'm sorry, the tree died. Oh, you're sitting in the sun. You can see catty friends like having that exact same conversation. And so once you put that lens there, it starts showing up more and more and more and more.
That's wonderful. That's fascinating. Thank you. All right, shifting gears a little bit. So let's say I'm someone who works with youth. I'm on board with this idea of establishing policies for young people with an eye towards inclusion, but it's a new endeavor for my church. So there's likely to be some pushback from somewhere. And, you know, even personally, I know even in very progressive settings, I've experienced some folks express concern about multi-stall bathrooms, right, that anyone can use. So how do we respond to that kind of pushback to such folks from a place of both hope that they're, you know, sometimes we're all on a journey and some of us walk more quickly on that journey than others. So how do we approach these folks with hope, but also with boldness for moving forward?
Yep. Yeah. And I'm a very pragmatic person. Let me say this, and I wrote this in the book too. It is possible that there is so much pushback in your congregation that you are going to be like the one safe person that, you know, you're not going to get support from your supervisor, your senior pastor, the church council, whatever. You being a helpful, supportive person in the midst of a larger congregation that maybe is not there can be a good thing in and of itself. And then you can think and talk about how to grow and expand that so it is your youth ministry, that it is your whole congregation. This is, once again, where leading with values is incredibly important. And part of this conversation really goes back to, again, who are we as a community, and what do we value, and what do we believe, and what's the way in which we live that out. Before I worked for GLAAD, I worked for the Lutheran LGBTQ advocacy organization. Now it's called Reconciling Works. And part of the job was to help congregations go through a process where they would make a statement of welcome that included LGBTQ people or people of all sexual orientations and gender identities. They have a really good toolkit for how to get to that process. And for them, the end result is making the statement and getting it adopted. But the faith-based community organizing that goes into that process is incredibly helpful, and can also be, how do we start this quietly with a core group of people that I know are supportive and that I know are on board? How do I do an assessment of where I think the congregation really is and what realistically we can do to move that forward? How do I get the key players to also be helpful and supportive in that too? And that's going to be a long process. That toolkit, there's a self-assessment thing, and it sort of says, if you're at the most progressive congregation, it's still probably going to take you like at least 9 months just to make sure that you do this right and it gets adopted in a really good way. If you're a congregation that that there's going to be struggles, it might be a 3 to 5 year process. But the more you continue doing this, like small groups, one-on-ones, talking to people, introducing these ideas of how our values, our beliefs, our scripture also point to welcome, inclusion, advocacy, human dignity for LGBTQ people, we can get there. And again, perfectly pragmatic, I would be fine with a super low bar, right? I cheered, and I get it, I cheered when Pope Francis said, denounced criminalization laws, right? Maybe just saying people shouldn't be arrested or killed, it's a very low bar. But if I can make sure that I get you on board with that, then I can figure out how to work toward the next thing. And your congregations are probably in different places, not in the same place that we're not that global, but thinking through that. And so if we look at what those bills and laws are, especially as you click through that Equality Federation link and look at your own state, and say, this is one that just seems like really harsh and really one that goes even too far for us. Coalescing support around that and making sure that you have people vocally talking about that can also be really, really helpful. And then that opens the door to, so what does that mean for us? What does that mean for a child who's been part of the congregation since they were born, is now come out? How do we make them a part of our community and make them feel like they're part of the community? Or what does it mean if a visitor comes and is part of our community as well?
That's really helpful. Thank you. It strikes me that as I think about the way Jesus ministered to the disciples, I think about Jesus on the road to Emmaus, right, which is a scripture coming up very soon in lectionary. And he met people exactly where they were, and he accompanied them to the next spot and the next and the next, and just allowing that time on the road for relationship building. And that's helpful. That's really helpful. All right.
And yes, I see the chat. That is the exact link that I use a lot.
That's perfect. Thank you. Thank you. All right. I'm curious to hear about your thoughts on external witness. So sometimes our affirming congregations try to have an external witness showing up at rallies and other events, but oftentimes they're one-offs. And you alluded to this when you were talking about the interesting twist on Palm Sunday, right? And these one-off events often don't carry a lasting relational impact. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on possible ways that churches can be intentional about their witness in this area from a more relational perspective that might carry a little more weight.
Yeah. Well, and especially that, again, the fact that we have Palm Sunday, like I am in the midst of helping a lot of people and places and stuff planned for Pride as well. And my latest thing, and I'm glad I'll do some corporate stuff too. So I will be like, don't do it during June. Like June is saturated. That is like Pride month. It's very hard to participate in Pride without making it look like marketing for yourself. And I think that's true for churches as well. If you're going to go and participate. Don't like, hey, maybe we'll get some members because we have a booth here. Listen, hear what people are doing, hear what people are saying, bring a contingent from your congregation. And then you do really, really want to think about what are those other moments. First of all, there are, besides June and Pride month, and not all Prides are in June, I got to say that too. I don't know how many of you are in the South, but it is too hot to do a Pride march in June when you're in Texas or Atlanta or whatever. So some of these are in October because it's cooler. So there's that. There are a lot of LGBTQ holy days, commemorative moments. There are, and they go all year long. There's Bisexual Awareness Week in September. There's Transgender Day of Visibility that comes at the end of March. There are HIV days or World AIDS Day on December 1st. There is National Coming Out Day in October. There's Spirit Day, which is also GLAAD's a part of too. Please do Spirit Day, which is an anti-bullying campaign. And Spirit fits really well with our churches and us participating and going purple and wearing purple as a sign of spirit, because spirit is the color associated with purple on the rainbow. If you don't know that, every color has a thing. It's like a word it's attached to, and purple is spirit, which is why it's Spirit Day. That's a really churchy thing to do, right? And it comes up at a different time of year. It's a campaign. Another one that your churches could be involved with the right kind of partnership, Transgender Day of Remembrance is November 20th. I advise corporates not to do things for this, because that is a memorial service. It is remembering transgender people that died because of violence. And that number also increases every single year. So our churches are good at doing memorial services, right? That is part of what we do. If we work with a local transgender organization, we might be able to be the host to help make that happen. Again, don't do it for marketing, do it because it's a ministry part of the community. And that is using those kind of days for either your own programming or that visible witness. Wearing purple externally or going purple, whatever externally can do that. Having those partnerships with those local organizations, your LGBTQ center, your local trans organizations, your state organizations, which sometimes is, how can we help? What can we do? How can we show up? And what resources do we have that might be able to be in partnership with you? And knowing that that relationship has to be built on trust. And because of our Christian history, that trust might not be there, and we're gonna have to work to earn it. And then I will also say, because I seem very fixated on legislation, that's a big thing right now. Legislations for the most part is kind of a season, right? Most legislatures kind of mostly run between January and June. So I remind people, by the time we get to Pride Month, we are exhausted because we were getting beat up by those 450 bills, and then we get to June. That means you have 4 or 5 months in a lot of your states to be a part of that process early on. That's a relationship with your local elected leaders. Before these bills ever get introduced, proactively communicate those values. Tell them these anti-LGBTQ bills are against your values and tradition, and you hope that the people that are representing your area are not backing and supporting them. Do it before they ever get introduced, and then once they do, be tracking those. I show you that map. It's overwhelming. 450 in 50 states. Again, the math on that is just nuts. But if you focus on your own state, that makes it a little bit more manageable, right? And clicking in and knowing these things exist. And that gives you half the year of the work that you can do that just is that continual sort of conversation. And then of course, when it's not an active legislative session, so we're in the second half of the year for a lot of us, how do we communicate those values as a way to set up for the next year as well? And that can be those monthly school board, town council, whatever other kind of meetings too. And I think those are places we can think about how we show up as clergy, wearing our collars with our, I know deacon don't get a collar, but the stuff that will signify us, but also maybe bringing our youth group with us. I write in the book about, here's what an outing could look like of going to a rally. What if instead of a ski trip, which I know a lot of our churches like to do, what if we also did a visit to the Capitol, right? And go as Central Lutheran Church and wearing our little church t-shirts and do a Bible study around these themes that we've talked about, and make it an educational, edifying opportunity, and then be able to do witness in public, and then come back and debrief and talk about what that is and means for us, and how it goes with our faith. That's a faithful activity that also does some kind of good in the world.
Yeah, I so appreciate 1,000 things you just mentioned, but we talk a lot at the YMI about building leaders and cultivating leadership among our youth. That this is not a top-down conversation. This is a conversation that we invite the youth and empower the youth to feel like they have a stronger voice in. So I'm very curious about that.
Can I say
yeah, please do.
I assume you've covered this as well. We talked about a lot. Gen Z, I gave their numbers. They are very values driven. They are very, when I do this with corporations, they want the institutions they work with to reflect their values. They want to do business with byproducts from companies that they know are doing their values. And our churches should and could be a part of that, which means they're already taking leadership. And so it's not us having to like do it for them. It really is like, can we help support you so that you can do it, find it, be it, even better using the resources that we have. And I think our churches are really well positioned to do that if we can do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Of course, the little, not so secret in youth ministry is that the youth are always leap years beyond us in so many ways, and we can learn so much from them. How do we encourage youth to become more connected and advocates? I mean, I know in many ways, Gen Z is already doing a lot of that stuff. We had a speaker about a year ago, Mixiati Martinez, who spoke to us about safe space versus brave space, and talking about how safe space is hugely important, but we also need to lean into the idea of a brave space. So I feel like that's connected to this idea of advocacy. Can you share a little more about some of that?
Yeah, it's a little, I mean, I like that. I like that thought. And I think of the naming project camp, or that like LGBTQ specific, it's a set apart space, right? Like you get to go away from the rest of the world and do a little like, who am I? How do I relate to the rest of the world? What do I believe? What's my relationship with God? That like self-care that you need, the safe space kind of thing. And then you have to be back out in the wider world, right? They're only with us for a week, and then we push them back out of the route where they're going to go back to school and jobs and family and everything else too. And so, we can think of our churches, our ministries, as the like refueling station that also helps to connect them with what the right organization is, who the right leader is. We don't have to be the LGBTQ experts. We just have to know who they are, and who those trusted partners are that we work with. And when we hear young people, one of my jobs also is working with a Lilly grant, so I've used the word vocation a lot in my life. If any of you have like gotten vocation money from Lilly, you know what I'm talking about. But you hear them talk about where their passion is, or their energy, or like, I really want to do or change or be this. Great, let me help get you connected to the people that can help you to do that, right? Let's find out who that good trusted partner is. Let's get you connected with those local LGBT centers, or the GSA at school, or the statewide organization, or a national organization that they can access resources online. And we can be that local grounded person that's like, how's it going? Are you connected? Do you feel valued? Do you feel safe? Right? Making sure that they're all good while they do it. But also it helps to give them that kind of outlet. And then because we're churches, we get to put a theological or spiritual lens onto that as well, and help them to carry that too. And so we hear, and again, this is beyond you care about climate change. A lot of Gen Z does, because they have to live in this world that we are ruining at the moment. And so, okay, if you want to do that, I know our churches can go so far on this, but I also know there's people that do this better. And how do we build those relationships with them? And then say, for our young people, this is a great place for you to put that energy and attention into some way that you can do it and incorporate into your life. You care about, legislation or anti-bullying, or Glad's very media representation, right? And so like there are organizations that do that. And there's organizations for LGBTQ that look at the intersection of LGBTQ and race, entertainment, sports, politics, healthcare, in the environment, all that stuff, right? And we can help kind of do that sort of like sorting and directing. And we're still the grounding for them too, that can help that can help them kind of know who they are, even as they're putting themselves out into the wider world.
I love that. I mean, again, to throw a scriptural spin on it, in a way, we're John the Baptist, right? We're pointing our youth towards, hey, this is where passion is, this is where life is, this is where godly life is. Go here, do this, right? I think that's really interesting. Okay, so you mentioned the development of spiritual practices as a growth area for faith communities, and we spoke about connection with scriptural stories. I wonder if in your work on this, you've identified any spiritual practices or approaches to spiritual practices that might be especially affirming for this community?
Mm-hmm. I mean, the nice thing is any of these can be good, right? It's the figuring out the practice. So, I mean, and some of these I'm just opportunistic. The camp that we go to has a labyrinth. One of our worship services is we're going to walk the labyrinth, right? And so we do a little explanation, we talk about it. The labyrinth is pre-Christian, right? And a lot of traditions use it, but we can, again, we put the theological lens onto it about what it is and that you're journeying. And sometimes you're journeying with someone and sometimes you veer away and you're by yourself. And we, interestingly enough, we sort of set it up in a way, and then this kind of happens. Some kids walk into the labyrinth just thinking it's the activity to do, and then kind of like get the weightiness as they go through it, and then connect. Honestly, this is just a pragmatic thing that happens for us too. I started resident years, youth would go to the center and they just sort of sit at the center and sort of like turn in on themselves, cry, be connect with themselves too. And, you know, it's kind of that, like, we can't stay on this mountaintop, like, and we also need to leave and go eat dinner at some point too. So I can't have you sitting there forever. Like, how do I disrupt that? And so, you know, I see that happening. What's the tweak that we make? You know what? One of my counselors, one of my leaders is in the middle before they begin. And when campers get there in the middle and they have their little moment too, after they've had a moment, you are going to give them a blessing and a prayer. And then you're also going to push them back out into the rest of the world. Like, I need you to come back out of the labyrinth. And someone's going to like be there to help facilitate making that happen too. So that happens, right? That is, that's the labyrinth. We can teach people the prayers that have been said for centuries. We can help them write new ones. We can do all of these things. And talk about Lectio Divina, to talk about meditation, to talk about something as simple as lighting a candle, right? And all of these things are ways to think about those particular blessings. I write this in the book too, but again, this developed at camp just because I once put a new counselor who he's a member of a church, but not like clergy or part of a leadership or any theological training or education. I was like, you're in charge of Campfire. And he took that to mean, I'm going to talk about the best spiritual example of Christianity that I know of, Dolly Parton. And he read quotes from Dolly Parton and things that she said, made the campers try to guess who it was. They did not do well that first year. Played some of Dolly Parton's songs, including Jesus and Gravity, including Traveling Through from Transamerica. And then somehow this evolved because our camp is, I don't know if I didn't mention this, our camp is on an island. So you have to pontoon to get to the actual campsite itself. And they said, you know, with a small enough group, we could do campfire on the pontoon. We, again, light some candles, go out in the middle of the lake on a calm evening. We now pair pontoon campfire with Dolly Parton night. And the same counselor and leader will talk about, you know, how she has been an example of faith and an example of Christianity. He plays some of her songs, usually including those two and maybe one or two others that are thematic. He reads those quotes. He talks about what sort of impact he had on her. And then, you know, we play our music and it sort of just like kind of soars across this lake as we're sort of drifting out there in the middle of something. That made a spiritual moment. It's very weird and very specific. You all can't do pontoon Dolly Parton campfires. But I mean, you could try. But, you know, sometimes we create those spiritual practices just because they come from our community or tradition, or we glom things together. And I always find this funny. You probably know this as youth ministry people too. Like, you do something once and we did it as an experiment. And then like the campers that come back are like, well, that's a tradition. We do it all the time. It's like, no, we made that up one time. And we did it because we found a mirror laying around and made something out of it. We did. So like, you know, we come up with these practices and then we can make it a thing, which means we can make those practices, which means they're very queer. We've now queered those spiritual practices and said, we're doing this thing, but we're making it specifically for you. And they feel that special connection with it too. So, you know, take what's out there and they can all be LGBTQ, or figure out how to like mishmash stuff together because it reflects your community. And that also becomes really good and really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so fun. I mean, I have heard that youth ministers or people who do youth work are often among the most innovative folks in ministry because they have to be. You have to kind of make up stuff on the fly and throw in this and figure out that and how do you handle this situation. And it's deep joy for those who are called to it. For those for whom the vocation is clear. Yeah. All right, so we have a few minutes left, and again, folks, feel free to throw something in the chat. But I'll name a personal bias I have about God. So I've always been persuaded that God is bigger than gender, that God transcends gender. And if we believe that, there's the perspective that follows, which is that both God and creation are expansive in so many ways, sexuality and gender being among them. So, what would you think? And I'm guessing maybe this is too basic of a question, but I'm curious, what do you think about ministering from that understanding and what that means for LGBTQ youth who've always heard of God as He? What does it mean to really kind of expand that and do away with that or break it up? Or, yeah.
I honestly, it's one of when we do that, we expand people's minds and hearts and worldview in such a particular way. And you people asked about like one of those stories before, like Moses in the burning bush, and the fact that God doesn't say God's name because that is too containing and too under our like human structures and authority. And when Moses said, "Who sent me?" and God's answer, is this: "I am who I am. I will be who I will." Again, the Hebrew people know this better than I do. God can't stay in one tense when describing God's own self. And so the idea of like, well, God has to be male. And what does that mean to be male? Does that mean having a penis? Does that mean God has testosterone? Does that mean, these kind of things? And realizing like, well, God's already beyond all of that. And I will say too, the other one that always sort of intrigues me is, if we're from churches that do Trinitarian theology, the Trinity is super queer, right? How are we believing? Like, again, if people can think like, if people get really hung up on there can't be more than two genders, but then we talk about a God, one God who is three different figures that are all the same thing, but all very distinct from one another. And in this weird intertwined thruple-y relationship with God's own self, that is, it's big, it's huge, it's confusing, and queer becomes a very good word to describe it, because we do a lot of stuff to try to contain it, to try to understand it, to diagram it, to do this. We have people preach sermons on it one Sunday a year, trying to explain it to people. And yet for someone who, again, someone seeing themselves as like, I don't feel like I fit into these categories that exist. Well, guess what? You can relate to God because God doesn't exist. It doesn't fit within these categories that we exist. And then for other people, we go back and we revisit those stories over and over and over again. That helps people to think about, get that same reaction that Danny does during our podcast of like, why has no one ever talked about this before? Are we fitting scripture into the way that we understand the world, or are we letting the stories that we have written down and told about God actually like blow our world up in a really big and expansive way? And we can do that through God's creation. We can do that through I am who I am. We can do that through the theology of the Trinity, which is super confusing, and yet at the same time can be like super comforting when we don't feel like we fit into those the categories that exist for us too. And that's, I'm saying this, that's not just good for youth. It's not just good for LGBTQ people. That's good for all of us to hear. And so there is this expansiveness of like, this is not just ministry for youth, that's silent, queer youth that's silent off by themselves. It actually helps all of us feel like we're building a better relationship with God, the creator, God, the redeemer, God, the sanctifier.
Yeah, we recently had Mark Yaconelli come and do an in-person presentation on storytelling. And so much of it is about how youth find themselves in the story and how we as adults and youth workers find ourselves in the story. So being able to find ourselves in the identity of God in a way that feels very welcoming and joyful. That can only be affirming, that can only be lightening and provide a sense of belonging for these young people. So yeah.
I've loved the comments that have come up in the chat. I kind of quickly did a scan
please,
of them too.
Please do.
Resource sharing. Polly Murray having a feast day is amazing. And we, her stories need to get told more and more. There's so much that we can be doing, which is great.
Yeah. The chat always ends up being in these sessions some of the best resourcing that this group does. So folks, you will at the end of this presentation give us a little bit of time, but you will get a recording. And if Ross is willing to share his PowerPoint, you'll get some nuggets of that as well. or at least portions. We can talk about it, and the chat as well, folks. So you'll be well resourced from this event, and I can think of no better way to end. So Ross, thank you so much for joining us. Folks, thank you for joining us. Blessings on your ministry, blessings on your work with young people, and allowing them to see the expansiveness of our God. Thank you. Thank you so much.